welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, continuing to take a look at the next week's slate and heading down to the SEC championship game where I think there's a lot of college football fans that would make the argument you're about to watch the two best teams in the country go to war for an SEC title. The way Georgia and Alabama have looked, and I get it was sloppy on Saturday. I think that was a massive look-ahead spot for both of these teams. There's a strong argument. You're going to look at the best two teams in the country going at it. We've had this one circled for the last couple weeks. Really excited to get into it. Before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys and a special shout out to the SEC fans. I mean, this is two teams that we've talked a ton about leading up into this game. You guys have shown just a ton of support to the boys. If y'all do enjoy the content and you want to support the fellas, consider subscribing to the channel. And more importantly, would love to hear from you guys in the comment sections. Picks, predictions, keys to the game. We'll chop it up there. Without further ado, let's get into this one. Dylan, I'm going to give you the T-Box, Bama, Georgia, SEC title on the line. How we feeling here?
Yeah, and obviously both teams kind of coming off, I would say, lackluster performances. I mean, both won, but both teams didn't dominate, I think, the way they were supposed to, the way Vegas said they were supposed to. And I think that's kind of natural when you're leading into the real game, if you will. And this was, I'm sure these two teams looked at 2 weeks ago and was like, well, this is pretty much what it's going to come down to. And here it is. I'm very happy Alabama pulled that game off, and nobody loves a good Iron Bowl more than me and you. But it is more fun. Now this game is epic. If Alabama had lost that, it would have taken some wind out of it. Now it's coming in, and you got the real hype.
I get it was sloppy for both teams. I guarantee you. I mean, Georgia spent a lot more time prepping for Alabama last week than they were prepping for Georgia Tech, and I think you could say the exact same thing for Nick Saban and Alabama. I mean, you're prepping for Georgia. You didn't spend that much time on the Auburn Tigers, and I think that's why you're going to get the best performance from both of these teams this Saturday, not only because the stakes are the highest, but these two teams are as ready for one another as they're going to get. Dale, I want to start with this Georgia offense, and I want to go back to the conversation we had 3 to 4 weeks into the season, where a lot of the national media talking heads were talking about Georgia not looking the same along the offensive line that they had the last couple of years. They were outside of the top 40 in yards per attempt running the football, and you look up, and in classic Kirby Smart Georgia Bulldog fashion, they're peaking at the right time. They're now averaging 5.3 yards per rush. That's 12th in the country, and Kendall Milton has emerged as that guy in the Georgia backfield. We kind of talked about this last week. This is not a knock on John Edwards and what he is doing at Georgia. It's more of just Kendall Milton is a little bit different. And I think the ceiling for Kendall Milton is extremely high. This is the healthiest and best he's looked as a Georgia Bulldog. Averaged 8.7 yards per carry against Georgia Tech. This Georgia rushing attack going up against an Alabama defense that struggled to stop the run against Auburn, I think going to be a massive storyline in this one.
Yeah, and I think if you're watching George, you notice Kendall Milton with a little something different. I mean, I think back that play that there were two guys blitzing. Georgia Tech had a perfect play call on it. Two guys with him in the backfield. He just has that jump cut ability, gets 8 yards. I mean, that's like a different level of skill. And Dejon Edwards is a really solid running back, but he doesn't, you're right. He doesn't have that, like, some of those special traits that I think Milton has. But as much as Milton's been part of this, it's a lot of this offensive line just simply playing a lot better. And Amarius Mims coming in, I think he's looked really, really good, especially in the run game. That's allowed Xavier Truss to go kicking on that guard spot. And I thought Morris came in, frankly, and did a really good job at left guard, spelling for Tate Ratledge and Truss and Mims on one side. That's a dominant unit. I mean, they can really move guys. They create a lot of space. And you're right. If you give Kendall Milton the crack of daylight, he can take it.
Yeah, this Georgia offensive line has turned into the offensive line that we've expected. And we've talked a lot about Carson Beck, and we'll talk about him in the matchup in the passing attack. But I think a large story of Georgia turning into this juggernaut team the last couple of weeks has started up front. And just clearly, to any college football fan watching these Georgia Bulldogs play, like, they're different up front. They're moving bodies. They're creating a lot of space for these running backs. And Dale, I want to talk a little bit about this Alabama defense in terms of stopping the run. What excites me most about this game is Alabama is probably most equipped of any team in the country to deal with Georgia up front. They just struggled against Auburn. And I think maybe Hugh Freeze, you got to give him a lot of credit for being in his bag, creating a lot of conflict for defenders. But the run fits weren't great for Alabama. And no doubt that is something that Nick Saban is going to really hammer home the next couple of weeks in practice, because you can't be as bad stopping the run against this Georgia team and expect to win an SEC championship.
And what I'm kind of interested to see from Georgia is, like, you see why Auburn has made some really good defensive fronts struggle, especially those more aggressive defensive fronts like Alabama and Georgia. Is Hugh Freeze and that Auburn team do a really good job of putting linebackers in conflict, and it just slows them down. I mean, Lawson and Jahad Campbell are two guys who I feel like have been really, really good, especially with the emergence of Campbell. And as Lawson gets back healthy, it did feel like they were a step behind essentially, and they weren't fitting those. They weren't getting the guys. They missed a couple of tackles. Georgia kind of plays more of a pure rushing attack, I will say. In that, again, that's kind of what Alabama's built to stop. They have big, heavy, physical defensive linemen. Their linebackers like to come downhill and play physical. I'm wondering if Georgia can kind of add in some of those wrinkles, like either use like an Arian Smith or some of those Dylan Bell, some of those more athletic wide receivers to get somewhat involved in the run game and just put Alabama in conflict, because you saw how well Auburn was able to do that, and that was very effective.
Yeah, and it was fun. I mean, it's funny because Georgia struggled in a lot of the similar ways to stop Auburn's rushing attack that Alabama did on Saturday. So I do think that is an interesting question. The next part I want to go to is this Georgia passing attack, and we've talked about it. Carson Beck not only took over this Georgia offense and kind of took over where it left off, he's elevated this Georgia offense. And the throws that he makes consistently on Saturdays, those are NFL caliber throws. He looks like one of the best quarterbacks, not only in the SEC, but in the country. You look at Alabama in their secondary. One, I think their secondary is about as talented as it gets. I think Georgia and Alabama have a great argument to be two of the best secondaries from a talent standpoint that you see across the country. Where Alabama struggled with, and very similar to how they struggled in the run game, some of the schemes, right? Auburn did a lot of things Tennessee did last year against Alabama in terms of stacking wide receivers, kind of rubbing off guys, creating those meshes. And Alabama struggled. I mean, Peyton Thorne was only 5 of 16, completed 5 passes against Alabama secondary. That being said, those passes were big plays because Alabama had some breakdown in coverages, and they weren't passing guys off the right way. I wonder if Mike Bobo and this Georgia offensive staff see that Alabama struggle with that, say, hey, we're going to try to go to that too. And they have better athletes than Auburn does to continue to hit those explosive plays.
Yeah, and if they can get their guys healthy and have guys like Rara and Ladd back, and obviously Brock Bowers, I would bet my life that he's going to play. I think they were probably holding them out just as more of a precaution. But if they get those guys back, you're right. That has been one thing that Alabama's, they have given up the deep ball in a handful of games, and in Georgia that's been like when we talk about Carson Beck elevating this offense, we've talked about being able to push the ball downfield consistently. And again, they've been able to hit big plays in the past, but it wasn't at the same clip, if you will, and attack that intermediate and deep half of the field. That will be an interesting thing, because Alabama, yes, they're very talented, but you're right. They have, at the end of the day, given up some big plays, and I think Georgia's probably got the best passing attack they've really seen. I would take it over Texas personally.
I would, the way Carson Beck would, I would too. How do you think Alabama deals with Brock Bowers, like personnel-wise?
And that's like a tough one. It's like we can all kind of suspect, like, oh, how do you stop this guy? It's like there probably isn't that answer. And again, I'm not a defensive coordinator. I don't like, do they bracket him? Do they, like, those kind of buzzwords you hear teams throw out? I'm sure they'll try to figure out some answer, but it will be about containing him. I do think one advantage Alabama has is 2 big, long, athletic linebackers, especially with the emergence of Jahad Campbell. Like, those 2 can really run.
I wonder if you see a lot of Malachi Moore on him too. Like, Malachi Moore is a guy that I really like, and I think has the traits to maybe deal with Brock Bowers a little bit. And at the end of the day, Brock Bowers, you talk about him in a very similar way you talk about Marvin Harrison Jr. Like, you can try to stop him. There's not really any stopping Brock Bowers. Like, he's going to get his. As Michigan fans, we watched that Ohio State game yesterday afternoon and said, like, there's just going to be plays where one of the best players in the country is going to make those plays, and you have to be at peace with that. But I do wonder how they try to take Brock Bowers away without sacrificing, because what makes Georgia so special this year is Brock Bowers ain't the only weapon, right? I mean, if Lab McConkey's back or Dominic Lovett had a really good game, a guy like Dylan Bell or Marcus Rosemary-Jackson, like they got guys. So you can't just be like a racehorse blinder on Brock Bowers, because there are a lot of other guys that could hurt you in this Georgia offense. They'll flipping sides. This Alabama offense and what makes Alabama so special, we knew this defense would be solid. Jalen Milro looks like a completely different quarterback than he did the first couple of weeks of the season. And I get Alabama might have struggled on offense against Auburn. That was not Jalen Milro's doing. I thought he looked extremely comfortable extending plays, making teams hurt with his legs. And you look at what Georgia has struggled with on the defensive side of the ball, going back to the Auburn game, with the mobile quarterback that can do some misdirection stuff. I'm really excited to see what Georgia can do against a guy in Jalen Milroe who can hurt you in so many different ways.
Well, and that's I'm wondering if we'll see a little more activity or involvement in the run game for Jalen Milroe. I feel like
yes, you will.
Season, they've wanted to play more of that pure, again, how Georgia plays it, that inside tackle run game using their big physical offensive line. I know they do mix in some read option, but probably not as much as I think we all would have thought. I think you've seen it at times, like against LSU.
I was going to say, in the biggest games, Jalen Milroe is going to use his legs. Like, I think they're just games where it's like, we don't need Jalen Milroe taking hits. In this kind of game, like, you're going to see Jalen Milroe in the run game, I think, be a factor, because they know they need him to be that kind of guy to beat Georgia. And again, going back to where Georgia struggles, some of that misdirection stuff and attacking the perimeter and getting outside, that's where they've struggled. So I do think you're going to get a healthy dose of Jalen Milroe being an athlete, because at the end of the day, he's probably the best ball carrier that Alabama has in that offense. There's two other kind of things I have in my notes. Alabama has been extremely good hitting the deep ball, whether it's Jermaine Burton, whether it's Isaiah Bond. They have been extremely explosive in the passing attack, and you're looking at a Georgia defense that just doesn't give that stuff up. I mean, they're only giving up 5.8 yards per pass attempt. That's number 5 in the country, a 56% completion percentage. Can Georgia scheme up? Or can Alabama, scheme up some explosive passing game against this Georgia defense that really hasn't given up that all year?
Yeah, and that will, I think, be the hard part, because you haven't really seen any team really able to do it. I think you're right, though. I think at the end of the day for Alabama, it will be trying to keep the ball on the ground and doing some of the things that have hurt them. Because I'm just looking at this secondary. I think it's dominant. It's got 4 elite players at both corners and then the safeties. There's just, I don't see how you can build your offense against Georgia at all around hitting.
I completely agree, because this is by far not only the best, talent-wise. Every guy in that secondary, whether it's Trevon Bullard, Tyke Smith, Malachi Starks, the list goes on and on. They're going to be in the NFL. But more importantly, they're all really experienced. Alabama's relied on kind of scheming up some big plays, getting behind some younger secondaries like LSU or like Texas A&M. Georgia ain't going to give you that. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for Alabama's. If the big play is not there, can Jalen Milroe work that intermediate game, which I think he's massively improved on, but that's probably going to be the avenue that Alabama finds success. And the last big storyline I think I have here, Alabama and pass pro, stopping a Georgia pass rush and then keeping Jalen Milroe in the pocket. How you balance, we want to go after Jalen Milroe. We want to disrupt him in the pocket, but we also have to keep him in the pocket and not let him beat us with his legs.
And that is the one thing I think Alabama has working for them is, their offensive line has taken some massive steps.
Yes,
you see how much better Booker and Proctor have gotten with the introduction of Roberts on that right guard spot. Very, very good. And Georgia still, it just doesn't feel the same with their defensive line. And it's good. It's not it's good nationally, but it's not like that same Georgia defensive line that just eats teams alive. If they were that, I do think Alabama was looking at, that's a real problem, because you're at times Alabama still does have their moments in pass protection. I don't see Georgia when you feel like there's just no chance this team can do anything because the defensive line is just so much better. I haven't seen that really from Georgia yet all year in terms of just shutting teams down with their defensive front. And I do think Alabama's gotten good enough on their offensive line that they should be able to hold up there. I just don't see that.
I don't even know if that's the question. I might frame that question wrong in the sense that I don't know how important it is. Georgia wants to be disruptive. to Jalen Milro. Like, no defense wants to just let a quarterback sit in the pocket and just go through his progressions. How much do you think Georgia pins their ears back and goes after Jalen Milro with the threat of him to break the pocket? That's kind of what I'm looking at. So I could see a lot of three-man pressures, dropping 8, having a spy there. And when Jalen Milro does break the pocket, you have some really talented guys, whether it's going to be a Tyke Smith on the spy or whether it's going to be one of the linebackers to go out and make a play on Jalen Milro. That's probably the biggest thing I'm looking at is how do you not only disrupt Jalen Milro, but you got to keep him in the pocket because he's at his best when he's extending plays, letting guys get open downfield. That's a lot of where their big plays come from is Jalen Milro, kind of some scramble plays, a little backyard football, get someone loose in the secondary. Dill, getting to the pick here, Georgia, 5-point favorites, Mercedes-Benz Stadium. How we feeling?
I think I'd be going with Georgia in this game just because I don't think we've seen Milro just be able to take games over. I don't see you just being able to, again, kind of put the ball on the ground against Georgia. I think the one dangerous part of what Alabama can do is not only Milro in the run game, but also some of their wide receivers. I think when you've seen that get introduced into the run scheme against Georgia, you've seen some big plays. I think Kendrick Law can be a huge part of this game, but I don't know that I trust this Alabama team enough to go beat the Dogs. Because you see when the Dogs are playing really, really good, there's just the way they beat up Ole Miss or some of these other games. It's just they're really playing some ball right now.
Georgia's playing some ball, and this is gonna pain me a little bit. I'm gonna take the points with Alabama, and I'm not necessarily because this is going to be I really do think these are two of the best teams in the country, and I think this is going to be arguably a national championship caliber game where it's back and forth, and teams are making both plays. 5 points. I'll take the Alabama Crimson Tide. Now, I get you're concerned about having to go to the last play of the game to beat the Auburn Tigers. I just don't think – I mean, like, Alabama played bad. Like, if you ask Nick Saban, I watched that game back this morning. They just did not play their best football. I think you've seen a lot of really good football from Alabama in the last couple of weeks. I think you're going to see that on Saturday. Georgia might win this game, but give me Alabama in the points here because I think this is a team that is extremely dangerous. And if you ask me, is there any team in the country that has the personnel to match up with Georgia? Not many teams can say that. I think the Alabama Crimson Tide certainly can. This is going to be a legendary game. Very excited for this one. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys again. If you do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.